Good morning. Rachel Notley is demanding federal action on the oil crisis, a plunge in prices that is costing the oil patch, Alberta, and Canada's economy tens of billions of dollars in revenues and as many as 100,000 jobs.
Federal government should be at the table on this, and in my view, there is very little excuse for their absence.
Notley is now on track with a made-in-Alberta answer. More rail cars to carry oil sands crude to the United States. She'll be pushing that idea again today in Toronto to business leaders. With politics, protests, and the courts putting a kink into new pipeline projects, Notley is pitching rail as an immediate fix to a problem that is derailing Alberta's economy.
We have a very distinct problem where we are selling our product for about $10 a barrel when the rest of the world's getting 50, and that cannot go on for any length of time. And so we have to start finding ways to ameliorate that problem.
Rachel Notley, as she spoke yesterday with Vashi Kappelos, who's the host, of course, of Power and Politics. We're going to begin our coverage this morning with John and with Scott as we look at some of the proposed answers as Alberta sees them. Thanks for being here to start things off. And Scott, let me start with you. This is costing, according to Notley, the Canadian economy $80 million a day, yes, this price differential. So where does the price stand as we begin our coverage this morning, and how do we get so low? Yeah,
this is after years of sort of an average price. The Western Canadian Select is what it's called. This is a heavier oil. It's more expensive to refine. It's been years of producing this oil, of sending it down to the U.S. and only having one market for it. So now we're finding ourselves in a place where it's hugely discounted to that of the U.S. equivalent, West Texas. For example, take a look at what I mean for these numbers here. The long-term average difference between the two, the West Texas Intermediate, what they have in the U.S. standard, it's a North American standard, and what we supply them, our crude, Western Canadian Select, is a $13 difference. That's how much more they get on average. For example, based on long-term reality, Western Texas sells at about $50 a barrel. Canada's bitumen sells at about $37. That's the $13 difference there that I'm talking about. Now, a real-life example based on yesterday's closing prices of these two commodities, we have West Texas coming in at $50.35. Canada bitumen, the Western Canadian Select, only $18, and so that's a difference there of a lot bigger. It's a $32 difference, more than double the long-term average. And why is it so low? There's too much of it for years. We only have one customer, that's the U.S.
99%, yes.
It goes down to that U.S. market, and now they are producing more oil than ever before. A lot of that is shale gas, but they do it a lot cheaper than what we do it here.
And those U.S. refineries are offering less money for the product because they know that Alberta producers are constrained. They have that limited market. So
right,
we'll talk about rail in a second, the short-term fix. But what we're also hearing, John, is some people saying, in order to drive the price up, got to cut the supply.
Grade 10 economics,
exactly.
Heather, that's how it is. If you're not getting enough for your product, and there's probably too much of it, and you could cut the supply off, and that's what we're hearing from a number of players in the oil patch, including Cenovus, saying that cut the amount down according to the province to do that, and then we could all make a little more money. That's the argument. That's also something being picked up by Jason Kenney. Let's not forget the political.
There you're talking about maybe adding a couple 100,000 barrels per day of production like a year from now. We're going to have a lot of companies that don't make it a year, 6 months from now. Like, I've met industry leaders who are talking in the range that collectively that there could be tens of thousands of layoffs in the first quarter of 2019, long before any government can add rail capacity.
So there's his argument there. It's not about pipelines in the long term, of course it is, and even rail cars in the medium term, but the most immediate remedy that he can think of is, and say, number of players in the industry. Worth noting, several other players, the larger ones, we're talking Suncor, we're talking Husky, we're talking Imperial, they're saying don't cut the production because they've invested in pipeline and refining capacity, so they've made an investment and it's paying off for them.
Talk a little bit more about, Scott, because the idea that Jason Kenney's floating is this production of 10% cut per day.
Right.
Is all of the oil patch, obviously, John suggesting not the case?
The larger producers, the ones that have put a lot of infrastructure investment and they're not happy about, the smaller players are going to be liking this, but they like the idea of any kind of infrastructure input whatsoever. They like the idea of the government funding. They like the idea of the government helping out with pipelines or with rail cars. That's free taxpayer money as far as industry goes. Here's the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers sort of outlining this double-edged sword, though.
These price differentials are largely the result of what we would consider to be market failures. Failures for effectively government to get the pipelines built in time so that we can get our product to market. We're absolutely supportive of the province stepping in and trying to help increase rail capacity for our sector. We generally don't like to see the governments intervene, but in this instance, we found ourselves in a spot where we really have no other options.
So, like I said, they don't mind the infrastructure investment, but the idea of some sort of cap, some sort of restriction, that goes very deep against the grain of what they do in the West and the oil lands there. It harkens back to the 1980s and the Energy Control Board, and also harkens back to the last time it was done was under Peter Lougheed, who instituted control. So they don't want that kind of government oversight. They don't mind that kind of infusion of cash. But the oversight's another thing.
All right. So overall, Rachel Notley, her government has not yet decided whether it will bring in mandatory production cuts. She said she's going to decide that within the short term. But she is very much talking about this rail plan, John. So what are the details of that?
Yeah, something that can be accomplished in relatively short order. Trying to find a price tag on that, but it would effectively allow them to ship 120,000 barrels a day. Now, these are called unit trains. Now, when you see the average train go by and you've got a hopper of gravel and you've got some potash and you've got some oil and you've got some petrochemicals, that's not what we're thinking of here. We're thinking of the cars all look the same. They're up to 100 wagons long. They're huge, and they effectively go from point A to point B. So there's no shunting around in the yards, no replacing. You go from where it is brought up to where it will be refined, and presumably that could be somewhere in the United States. But that's the sort of effectively pipeline on wheels that the Premier's talking about there. There is a price tag. What it is yet, they're still negotiating to buy, she says, but she wants the federal government to step into this and to help out, saying that the increased revenues from the moving of that bitumen would in fact pay off the investment that the federal government would put into this. Let's not forget in all of this, there's an election coming up in Alberta, so we have to look at this to a certain extent through the lens of politics and what the leaders are going to take to the electorate in just a few months.
And opponents of this say that a pipeline is safer anyways than putting all that stuff in a rail car. So very complicated.
And they say that Enbridge's Line 3 is coming online just at the time these rail cars would come online, and therefore would there really be a need for the rail cars? So there's a lot still up in the air, but she is very much selling this in Ontario right now. Thank you, gentlemen. And that's going to continue today when she speaks to the Toronto Board of Trade, 12:45 in the afternoon Eastern, and we'll have coverage on CBC News Network. Canada's oil and gas industry has not had a very smooth relationship with the country's Indigenous peoples, but there is a new report out that suggests a collaborative partnership between the two could bring big benefits to both sides. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers says the industry has an opportunity to support Indigenous reconciliation. While dozens of First Nations have been critical of major energy projects, CAP's CEO says that doesn't tell the whole story.
Where we're producing is either in partnership with First Nations on First Nations land, traditional territory, or we are utilizing First Nations businesses, skills, talents to enable production in other places. And that relationship, I think, has been very beneficial to both industry and Aboriginal communities and businesses for quite some time.
These resources help us pay for the elders' accommodations and their livelihoods too, especially through the tough days of winter.
CAP's CEO and Clayton Blood of the Kainai First Nation. Blood says he would like to see more Indigenous dealmakers in the industry and even Indigenous-owned oil companies. And that's in line with CAP's 5 recommendations for Ottawa, which include growing Indigenous economic participation, entrepreneurship, and partnerships.